Korean passive verbs source, howtostudykorean.com. Below is a list of vocabularies to be used in this lesson. Nouns.
냄새 나다, 스멜 청소기.
Vacuum cleaner.
얼굴, 페이스 시장, 마켓 몸, 바디 불.
Light fire.
숙제 이퀄 홈워크 기억 이퀄 메모리 상자 이퀄 박스 바람 이퀄 와인드 세금 이퀄 텍스 버브즈, 켜다 이퀄.
To turn on.
끄다.
To turn off.
숨다.
To hide oneself.
숨기다.
To hide an object.
고장 내다.
To break.
놓다.
To lay an object down.
눕다.
To lie down.
존경하다.
To respect.
대체하다.
To replace.
제공하다.
To provide. To offer.
포함하다.
To include.
내다.
To make something come up, arise, occur.
싸우다.
To fight.
속이다.
To trick somebody.
감동하다.
To impress.
서다.
To stand. Passive verbs.
잠기다.
To be locked.
켜지다.
To be turned on.
꺼지다.
To be turned off.
나다.
To have something you didn't have.
고장 나다.
To be broken.
화나다.
To be mad.
짜증 나다.
To be annoyed.
놓이다.
For an object to be lying down.
열리다.
To be open.
닫히다.
To be closed.
속다.
To be tricked. Adverbs.
자꾸 이퀄 리피터들이 인트로덕션.
This lesson contains a lot of boring, confusing grammar. I am warning you now. If you looked at the vocabulary list of this lesson before reading this, you may have noticed something strange with some of the words. A lot of the words look very similar to each other. The reason for this is because today you will learn about passive verbs in Korean. Though I studied passive verbs very early in my studies, it is something that actually took me a year to fully grasp, and not because it is incredibly difficult, but rather that I never received any proper instruction regarding passive verbs. I don't really like explaining English grammar too much in my lessons. However, an understanding of what passive verbs are and how they are used in English sentences will help you with your understanding of their equivalent Korean sentences. An active verb is used when a subject is in action. For example, in the examples below, the subject is I eat, I learn, I open. Active verbs often act on an object. For example, the word object here refers to the part of speech that a verb can act on. Sometimes learners get confused and think that an object means a thing. For example, a pencil or a door. In theory, any noun can be an object of a sentence, including people or abstract ideas that are not considered objects in the literal, non-language sense. For example, the objects are underlined in the following sentences. I love my father, he wants respect. I eat rice, I learn Korean, I open the door. Some active verbs by their nature cannot act on an object. For example, the active verbs are underlined in the examples below. I went to the park, I arrived at the park. The park in the above examples are not objects. The verb is not acting on that part of speech. They just indicate places within the sentence. In all of the above examples, regardless of if there is an object in the sentence or not, the subject performs the action. These are all active sentences. Passive sentences indicate that an action is performed on the subject. For example, I was kicked, the door was opened, the hamburger was eaten. In English, passive verbs feel like adjectives because their sentence structures are similar. For example, I was handsome, the door was big, the hamburger was delicious. Let's look at an active verb and passive verb being used in similar sentences. 1. I opened the door. 2. The door was opened. In the first example, I am the subject and I perform the action, opening, on the object, the door. In the second example, the door is the subject and the action, opening, was performed on it. Below are some more active passive pairs to help you see how they differ from one another. All of the examples below are in the present tense. In the present tense, these passive sentences, just like most plain sentences used in the present tense, sound unnatural. For example, I would never say I turn the computer on. However, I am using the present tense simply because this is the basic raw form of the sentence. They could be applied to the past, the future, or other complicated things could be applied to them. I turn the computer on, the computer is turned on. I lock the door is locked. I respect my friend is respected. I cooked the rice is cooked. Passive verbs, like adjectives, cannot act on an object. For example, I opened the door. Active verb, correct, the door was opened to me. Passive verb, incorrect, the door was big me. Adjective, incorrect. However, sentences with passive verbs can include more information to indicate by whom or by what the action was performed. For example, the door was opened by me, the door was opened by the wind, the door was opened by the guard. I'll do the same with all of the passive sentences that I showed you earlier. The computer was turned on by me, the door was locked by the teacher, my friend is respected by many people, the rice was cooked by my mother. Because passive verbs cannot act on an object, you will never see
을
in a sentence predicated by a passive verb in Korean. Remember,
을
is used to mark objects in Korean sentences, and therefore their usage is impossible with passive verbs. This is probably the most important paragraph in the entire lesson. It is usually unnatural to use passive verbs in Korean. In almost every situation, it is more natural to use the active form of a verb. For example, instead of saying the house is built, it is more natural to say somebody built the house, which implies that the house is now built. Nonetheless, understanding how passive verbs are used in Korean is crucial to your development. There are many ways to make a passive sentence in Korean. In this lesson, we will look at the different ways this can be done. It is also important to remember that passive verbs are verbs, not adjectives. Korean learners often think they are adjectives because they look, sound and feel similar to adjectives and they never act on objects. Always remember that passive verbs are verbs. This is important because you must conjugate them as verbs and not as adjectives. Alright, let's get started. Full stop.
Korean passive verbs.
하다,
to,
되다,
I've told you twice before that verbs ending in
하다,
can usually be separated from
하다,
to create a noun form of that verb,
하다.
then has the meaning of do.
나는 일했어.
I worked, which has the same meaning of
나는 일을 했어.
I did work, I worked. When dealing with
하다,
verbs, most of the time you can simply exchange
하다,
with
되다,
to make that verb passive. For example,
이해하다,
to understand,
이해되다,
to be understood,
포함하다,
to include,
포함되다,
to be included,
제공하다,
to provide,
제공되다.
to be provided. You can use these passive verbs in sentences, but remember, these sentences cannot act on objects. For example,
이 값은 세금을 포함해요.
this price includes tax.
세금은 포함돼요.
The tax is included adding
어,
to
돼,
creates either
되어,
or
돼,
with no difference in meaning. For example,
되다,
in the past tense can either be
되었다,
or.
됐다.
More examples. Active.
저는 점심을 준비했어요.
I prepared the lunch. Passive.
점심이 준비되었어요.
The lunch was prepared. Active.
회사는 기계를 대체했어.
The company replaced the machine. Passive.
기계는 대체되었어.
The machine was replaced. However, a lot of times you want to indicate by whom what the lunch was prepared, or by whom what the machine was replaced. For example, the lunch was prepared by the school, the machine was replaced by the company. In the examples above, although we are still using a passive verb, information about how the passive verb occurred is given. This is an example of when it is much more common to use the active form over the passive form in Korean. In Korean, and most likely in English as well, it would be much more natural to say I prepared the lunch instead of the lunch was prepared by me. Nonetheless, the grammar within these sentences is important, so I need to continue teaching it to you here. In order to create these sentences, you need to remember that sentences with a predicating passive verb cannot have an object, which means that you cannot attach
를,
to the school or the company. For example, the sentence below would be ridiculous and probably wouldn't be understood at all.
점심이 학교를 준비되었어요.
In these types of sentences, In order to indicate how by which means the passive verb occurs, you need to use different particles. If this part of a sentence is a person, it is acceptable to attach the particle
에게.
to the noun. For example,
그것은 이해되었어.
it was understood.
그것은 학생들에게 이해되었어.
It was understood by the students.
집은 청소되었어.
The house was cleaned.
집은 아버지에게 청소되었어.
The house was cleaned by my dad. Again, I highly suggest that you refrain from using this passive voice in Korean. I need you to understand what is being introduced here so I can build on it in later lessons. The two sentences above would be better said as,
학생들은 그것을 이해했어요.
the students understood that.
아버지는 집을 청소했어요.
My dad cleaned the house. The particle
에.
can be used when this part of a sentence is a non-person. For example,
점심이 학교에 준비되었어요.
the lunch was provided by the school. The particle
에 의해.
can also be attached to nouns that are non-people in these situations, but the distinction between
에.
and
에 의해.
isn't formally introduced until lesson 78. Since I'm advising against using this passive form, it's best to focus on the current presentation and not skip ahead. Also, remember the meaning of
으로.
which you learned in lesson 12. You learned that
으로.
can be used to indicate with what tool, device, method, material something is carried out. This means that you can say something like,
저는 집을 청소기로 청소했어요.
I cleaned the house with a vacuum cleaner. But, if you wanted to say that sentence by using the passive verb, to be cleaned, you would have to again use
으로.
as the particle attached to,
청소기.
because that was the method tool that was used for it to be cleaned.
집은 청소기로 청소되었어요.
The house was cleaned by a vacuum cleaner, whereas
집은 청소기에 청소되었어요.
is not correct, although most Korean people would probably understand you.
Woof. Zungfushink.
It's confusing for me. I'm sure it is confusing to you, and it is actually confusing to Korean people as well, so don't get too hung up on the difference between
에에게므로.
in these situations because, as I said, Korean people don't use passive verbs as much as they use active verbs. What do you need to take from all of this? Because it is so confusing. I wrote the main points that you should know. Clauses ending in a passive verb can never have a word with an object marker.
를.
Within the clause, passive verbs are conjugated just like active verbs. Even though they feel like adjectives, though clauses ending in a passive verb cannot have an object in the clause, other particles can be attached to nouns to indicate how the passive action occurred. These particles are usually
에.
to indicate that something occurred due to a non-person,
에 의해.
to indicate that something occurred due to a non-person, but we haven't studied this specifically yet,
에게.
to indicate that something occurred due to a person,
으로.
to indicate the tool method in which something occurred. One other thing, just because a noun in a passive sentence has the particle
에.
or,
에게.
or,
에 의해.
for that matter, attached to it, it doesn't necessarily mean that is the noun that caused the passive verb to occur.
에.
Could also have its more familiar function of designating a place. For example, we saw this sentence before.
세금은 포함되어.
The tax is included. I could put the noun
값.
in the sentence to indicate the location of where the tax is included in.
세금은 값에 포함된다.
The tax is included in the price. Notice in the example above that the particle
에.
is not denoting that the tax is included by the price. Rather, it is included in the price. Being able to recognize things like this just takes practice, and your understanding of this will increase as you progress through your studies. For now, try not to focus too much on the tiny parts of this lessons, and focus more on the big picture.
Korean passive verbs.
하다.
To.
받다.
In addition to the usual way of switching
하다.
with
되다.
to make a passive verb, there is another, similar, way of making these verbs passive. This can only be done with certain verbs, usually acting on people, and is done by switching
하다.
with
받다.
To receive. For example,
저는 저의 형을 존경해요.
I respect my brother.
저의 형은 존경받아요.
My brother is respected. Literally, my brother receives respect. The same rules apply with
에,
an,
에게.
as described previously.
교장 선생님은 선생님들에게 존경받아요.
The principal is respected by the teachers.
나는 너의 말에 감동받았어.
I was impressed with what you said. Remember that.
말하다,
Means to speak, by removing.
하다, 말.
Becomes the noun form of speak, which is words the thing you said, what you said, etc.
Korean passive verbs, non.
하다,
Verbs.
So far you have only learned how to change
하다.
verbs into the passive tense. There are, of course, many verbs in Korean that don't end in.
하다,
When dealing with words not ending in,
하다.
there is often a separate, but very similar, word that can be used to indicate the passive voice. These words will always be presented separately in the vocabulary lists. Here are some examples.
켜다,
To turn on,
켜지다.
to be turned on,
끄다,
to turn off,
꺼지다.
to be turned off,
닫다,
to close,
닫히다.
to be closed. The words above are just some examples of active verbs and their passive equivalents. There are many more of these active-passive pairs, and unfortunately there is no way to instinctively know which one is active and which one is passive. In all of the examples above, the longer word, that is the word with one more syllable, is the passive verb. However, sometimes the longer word is the active verb. For example,
붙다,
to be attached,
붙이다.
to attach,
끓다,
to be boiling,
끓이다.
to boil. If you look at these examples, you might think, oh, so maybe the pattern is, if there is an active-passive pair where
이,
is the difference between the two, then the longer word will be the active verb. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Here are two other examples of active-passive pairs that show the opposite.
쓰다,
To write,
쓰이다.
to be written,
보다,
to see,
보이다.
to be seen. There are many instances of these active-passive pairs in Korean, and there is no way to know which one is active or which one is passive unless you have specifically memorized it. This is just something that you will have to memorize whenever you come across it. The only thing that is helpful is that the active verb usually looks very similar to the passive verb, with just one syllable added or deleted from the active form. You can treat these passive verbs just like the passive verbs you learned in the previous two sections.
되다,
And
받다.
verbs, make sure you use the passive verb and not the active verb. For example, use
닫히다,
instead of
닫다.
in a passive sentence.
밥은 학교에 의해 제공된다.
Food is provided by the school.
밥은 학교에 의해 제공되었다.
Food was provided by the school.
문은 바람에 의해 닫혔어요.
The door was closed by the wind. When dealing with these passive verbs, however, you need to think about whether or not that passive verb is in the state of something. For example, every passive verb you learned in the previous two sections,
하다,
to,
되다,
and
하다,
to,
받다.
were not passive verbs in the state of something. For example, again,
나는 너의 말에 감동받았어.
I was impressed with what you said, simply means that you were impressed. It does not mean that you are in the state of being impressed. But, in these sentences, the computer is on, the TV is off, the door is locked. All of those nouns are in the state of something. The computer is in the state of being on, the TV is in the state of being off, and the door is in the state of locked. To indicate that something is in the state of something in Korean, you must add
있다,
to the passive verb. For example, as you know,
있다,
has many usages and meanings in Korean. Sometimes
있다.
is a verb, and sometimes it is an adjective, when used as
있다,
described here.
있다.
Is a verb. For now, this is only important to you when conjugating in the plain form. In the future, there will be other times when this distinction will be important.
저는 컴퓨터를 켰어요.
I turned the computer on.
컴퓨터가 켜져 있어요.
The computer is in the state of on.
저는 TV를 껐어요.
I turned the TV off. TV.
가 꺼져 있어요.
The TV is in the state of off.
저는 문을 잠갔어요.
I locked the door.
문이 잠겨 있어요.
The door is in the state of locked. Notice that
이가
is used in the passive sentences above. In most cases, this is usually more natural with these types of sentences. Don't worry about it for now. I'll discuss it in lesson 17, and focus more on how the verbs, both active and passive, are being used. I get a lot of people who are confused about this state nonsense of these passive verbs. I would like to fully describe how these words can be used to describe that something is in a state and compare them to the same passive verb that is not in that state. For example,
저는 문을 닫았어요.
I closed the door. This sentence is an active sentence. It has an active verb, and has an object. This should be no problem.
문이 닫혔어요.
The door was closed. This is a passive sentence. It is indicating that at some point in the past, the door was closed by something or someone. This is the exact passive equivalent of.
저는 문을 닫았어요.
The only difference is that we have no idea who what closed the door, though you could assume that the door, after that point, was in the state of closed. This sentence does not specifically indicate that.
문이 바람에 닫혔어요.
The door was closed by the wind. This is essentially the same sentence as above, but in this case we know how the door was closed. Again, though you could assume that the door, after that point, was in the state of closed. This sentence does not specifically indicate that.
문이 닫혀 있었어요.
The door was closed. This is another passive sentence, but notice the difference between this sentence and the two examples above. Here, the sentence is specifically indicating that the door was in the state of closed. Here, we have absolutely no idea if somebody had opened it recently. All we know is that, at that time, the door was not open.
저는 문을 닫아요.
I closed the door. This is another active sentence with an active verb, though it makes sense. It probably wouldn't be said like this unless there was some sort of adverb or other information in the sentence. For example, I close the door every day at 9 p.m.
문이 닫혀요.
The door closes. While technically correct, you would need some other information to make this sentence more natural. For example, the door closes every day at 9 p.m. This is the exact passive equivalent of.
저는 문을 닫아요.
Except for that in this example, there is no information given as to who what will close the door. The sentence is not referring to the door being in the state of closed, but rather, indicating that door somehow closes.
문이 닫혀 있어요.
The door is closed. Notice the difference between this example and the one above. This sentence is not referring to the door closing. It is only stating that the door is currently in the state of closed.
문이 닫힐 거예요.
The door will close again. This example is referring to the door somehow closing. It is the exact passive equivalent of.
저는 문을 닫을 거예요.
Except for that in this example, there is no information given as to who what will close the door.
문이 닫혀 있을 거예요.
The door will be closed. This is a passive sentence that is indicating that the door will be in the state of closed in the future. It does not indicate who what will close the door. All we know is that, at that time in the future, the door will be closed. Just because an active verb has a passive equivalent, it does not mean you can attach
있다.
to that word to describe that it is in the state of something. Typically this is only done for words like on, off, open, closed, etc. A good example of this not working with a passive verb is with
속이다.
an.
속다 속이다.
To trick somebody.
속다.
To be tricked.
나는 친구를 속였어.
I tricked my friend. This is an active sentence.
나는 친구에게 속았어.
I was tricked by my friend. This is a passive sentence.
나는 속아 있다.
I am in the state of being tricked. This doesn't make sense. Once you're tricked, you're tricked. You do not continue being in the state of tricked like a door continues to be open once it is open. Here's an example that I am including just because I have the audio for it. I'm going to get more example sentences for this lesson shortly with more audio clips.
펜이 탁자에 놓여 있었어요.
The pen was in the state of laying on the table. Korean passive verbs
내다.
an,
나다.
There are quite a few words in Korean that can either end in
나다,
or.
내다,
These two play the same role as
되다,
and,
하다,
where a word ending in
나다,
is passive and a word ending in
내다,
is active. For example,
끝내다,
to finish,
끝나다,
to be finished,
나다,
and
내다,
can actually be used as standalone verbs as well as be attached to other words. Both of their meanings are very complex and depend heavily on the situation, but their general meanings are
나다,
for something to come up, arise, occur.
내다,
To make something come up, arise, occur. However, not all words ending in
나다,
have an equivalent
내다,
verb, and vice versa. For example,
어긋나다,
is a word to be out of step with something, but
어긋내다,
is not a word. At any rate, the two most common words ending in
나다 내다,
are
끝내다,
to finish,
끝나다,
to be finished,
고장 내다,
to break,
고장 나다,
to be broken. It is very common to use the past tense conjugation of both of these words in the passive voice even when the thing is currently broken, finished. In English, we would say these sentences in the present tense, but in theory the thing task was broken, finished in the past. For example,
숙제는 끝났어요.
my homework is finished.
컴퓨터는 고장 났어요.
The computer is broken. It is possible to use the active voice to express these sentences, but the use of
나다,
as seen above is more common than the use of
내다,
in these cases. Nonetheless, the following are acceptable.
저는 숙제를 끝냈어요.
I finished my homework.
저는 컴퓨터를 고장 냈어요.
I broke the computer, as I said before.
나다,
Itself means for something to come up, arise, occur, which means it can be used in a lot of sentences to indicate that some noun comes up. 3 common ways to use
나다,
are with
기억,
a memory, with
생각,
a thought, and with
냄새.
a smell.
아, 그것이 기억났다.
Ah, I remember that. Literally, my memory came up.
좋은 생각이 났어요.
I have a good idea. Literally, a good idea came up.
그 가방에서 냄새가 났어요.
That bag is smelly. A smell is coming out of that bag.
그 방에서 냄새가 났어요.
That room is smelly. A smell is coming out of that room. Remember that.
나다,
Is a passive verb and cannot act on an object. Therefore, the particle
이가,
must be used on.
것,
You will learn more about this sentence structure in the next lesson. Another common example of
나다,
in use is in the following phrase.
큰일 났어요.
Literally, this translates to a big thing, task, work came up. In Korean, this expression is used similar to the expression oh no, something bad just happened. A more common expression would probably be oh crap. You'll see.
나다,
Used with many other words throughout your Korean studies. The most common examples of
나다,
or its active
내다,
form are the examples above. Other common examples that you will learn shortly are provided below. I haven't included these words in the vocabulary list above, so you don't need to memorize them now. I am simply introducing them to you at this point because they are related to this topic.
소리, 사운드 소리가 나다.
The verb of a sound happening, for a sound to come up.
화,
Anger, rage.
화가 나다.
To be angry, for anger to come up.
사고, 액서던트 사고가 나다.
To get into an accident, for an accident to arise.
땀 이퀄 스웨땀이 나다 이퀄.
To be sweating, for sweat to come up.
전쟁, 워어 전쟁이 나다.
For a war to start, for a war to come up.
멀미,
Motion sickness,
멀미가 나다.
for motion sickness to come up. In a lot of these cases, you will see
나다,
conjugated into the past tense when we as English speakers would think of the situation in the present tense. To explain this phenomenon, let me bring up an example from before.
아, 그것이 기억났다.
Ah, I remember that. Notice here that
나다,
is conjugated to the past, but I have translated the English sentence into the present tense. If you imagine your memory as a thing that can come up, in theory, the memory had already came up before you said that sentence, therefore making it in the past tense. Here, the context of the conversation can inform you if the speaker is referring to something in the past or present tense. It is possible to use these words in the present tense, but that would mean that the noun is currently coming up. A good example from the list above would be,
땀이 났어요.
I'm sweating. Here again, you can see,
나다.
conjugated to the past tense, but the English sentence is translated into the present tense, just by the nature of the word.
나다.
To come out. In Korean, when sweat has come out of your body, it means that you now have sweat on your body, which we as English speakers would say as I'm sweating. When
나다.
is conjugating into the present tense in these cases, it insinuates that the thing is currently coming up. In most situations, the difference is negligible and distinguishing them would really be splitting hairs. However, let's split some hairs.
땀이 났어요.
Sweat was coming out of my body, which means that there is currently sweat on my body, which means that I am wet from the sweat on my body that had previously come out of my body.
땀이 나요.
Sweat is literally currently coming out of my body.
저는 그것이 기억났어요.
I remember that, which means that I also currently remember that fact, which means that I know that fact that I had previously remembered.
저는 그것이 기억나요.
That memory is literally currently just coming to my mind. Really, this whole past-present thing is quite advanced and is not something I developed an understanding of until many years of exposure to Korean. As a beginner, you are still a beginner if you are only at lesson 14. You probably don't need to worry about splitting these hairs. However, when I was learning, I would have wanted this to be explained to me at some point, so here I am explaining it to you. I should point out that we don't see this same phenomenon when these words are used in negative sentences. For example, if I say,
그것이 기억 안 났어.
does the fact of your memory not coming up mean that it is currently not up when you said the sentence? I can't even wrap my head around that sentence. This type of past tense conjugated negative sentence with
나다.
would only be used to say that you didn't remember something sometime in the past. If you want to say that you cannot currently remember something, you can use the present tense conjugation. For example,
나는 그때 기억이 안 났어.
I didn't remember that at that time.
나는 그것이 기억 안 나.
I don't remember that.
Korean Passive Verbs, Normalverbs.
So far, you've learned about dealing with
하다 대답했다.
verbs that can be in a state,
닿다 닫히다.
and
나다 내다.
verbs, sometimes. However, a verb that fits none of these conditions can be put into the passive voice. All that needs to be done in these cases is to add
어지다.
to the verb stem to make it passive. Note that this cannot be done with all verbs, but some common examples are
주다.
to give,
주어지다.
to be given. Note that the word is
주어지다.
and not
주어지다 짓다.
to build,
지어지다.
to be built.
짓 플러스어. 지어 플러스 지다. 지어지다 기회가 주어졌어요.
I was given a chance.
그 집은 한국에서 지어졌어요.
That house was built in Korea. That's it. I warned you earlier. There was a lot of grammar in this lesson, though all of the grammar in this lesson is very important, and must be understood to continue your development of Korean. Keep in mind that it is always more natural to use active sentences instead of passive sentences in Korean. I'm sure you are very confused, but I did my best to describe everything somebody would need to know when having to worry about the passive voice in Korean. For more info, please visit howtostudykorean.com.